A different way of funding projects is detailed, and state agencies band together to curb substance abuse. Details in this week's Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. For decades, the state has worked to curb substance abuse. Last week, a new plan was unveiled that will help tackle an old problem. This group, representing state agencies, the medical profession, and the judicial system, unveiled a plan that targets early prevention as one component of the Minnesota State Substance Abuse Strategy. The plan is innovative in many ways.
What we're trying to do is to do our best to say a measure of our success certainly is the folks that you stop. Sometimes you stop. You really, literally, we're stopping them from hurting themselves and the others around them, and trying to break the cycle that way. But what are we doing then as a group to position them so that they don't come back? And that's what you're hearing today, is this a blueprint, an architecture that says we're going to be very intentional about this. It's not good enough for me to just say, well, I did my job as sheriff today. We enforced the law, we detained folks in a proper manner, and they had their day in court. That's not enough.
So there was a famous study published in the journal Addiction. It's called Mesa Grande. It's very easy to find. It comes from the University of New Mexico. It was a very simple clinical question. What works and what doesn't work for treatment of alcohol use disorders? They looked at 50 years of treatment literature. They found 350 studies that met their inclusion criteria. And then they looked at effectiveness and put the interventions in rank order from most effective to least effective. They found 46 discrete interventions and put them in order. At the very bottom, 46 out of 46 was just general education. Doesn't tend to work. Not far up above general education is highly punitive measures. They don't tend to work.
The Department of Human Services was key in developing the Minnesota State Substance Abuse Strategy. We have Commissioner Lucinda Jesson here to talk a little bit more about this plan. Thanks for joining us, Commissioner.
Oh, I'm delighted.
Let's begin with the press release and even the subsequent press conference. It was talking about this plan, tackling substance abuse in Minnesota head-on. How so?
Well, we, of course, try to tackle substance abuse across our state, but we all do it in our own little silos. And we are the first state to come together as a state with a statewide plan. You know, a national study said recently that 15% of state government costs are due in one way or another to substance abuse, to addiction. Some of those costs are in corrections, some in human services, some in education, some in health. So we needed not just one department or one agency to take this on. We needed a plan that we could all get behind, and that's what we put forward.
How do you think this plan is going to impact Minnesotans?
Well, I want at the end of the next few years to see more early intervention, more prevention, where substance abuse is being, where there's illegal use of substance abuse, though, we have to tackle that head on. You know, which I think overall we're doing a good job of in our state. One of the immediate priorities we set forward was to immediately do something to tackle opiate abuse, including heroin. So I want to see those numbers where we see today they're going up, more and more people coming into hospitals because of overdoses of opiates, of illegal use of prescription drugs, heroin. I want to see those numbers coming down in a couple of years.
Dr. David Friends was at the news conference discussing this plan, and he stated that the results of one particular study showed that public education and tougher penalties rank last in prevention of substance abuse. So you talked a little bit about trying to hit early prevention here, but does this plan move away from those elements overall, or does it just try to strengthen them and perhaps move them up in the rankings?
Well, we want to do more of what the evidence tells us works, and spend our dollars less on things that don't work. What Dr. Franz was talking about were these very general, untargeted public education efforts, which aren't nearly as effective as some of our evidence-based early intervention efforts. So we certainly need to do more public education, but we needed to do it in a targeted way where the evidence tells us we can make a difference with the dollars we spend.
And let's talk a little bit more about the money. You have said it's not just about the money, it's about doing more with what we have. So have there been any areas specifically identified where you think you can do more with the funds that you currently have?
Absolutely. I mean, we, just at the Department of Human Services, we have a lot of block grants, money from the federal government, some state dollars as well, that we send out to local agencies across the state to help tackles substance abuse and prevents substance abuse, to support recovery efforts. But we need to look at all of those dollars and say, okay, let's not spend those dollars just the way we have in the past. Let's look at what are the best practices, as Dr. Franz said, and make sure we're targeting those dollars to interventions that work, to support recovery in ways we know work. So that's just one example in our department. I think there may be legislative components of this. For an example, one of the things we said is we need to look at our prescribing monitoring, the way we monitor prescribing. And now we have very voluntary prescription drugs, right? So that if I'm a physician and I'm prescribing these opiates, something like Vicodin to someone, I'll be able to check and see, is that patient getting Vicodin from other doctors as well, and how much? So we need to take a look at how we monitor that system going forward. So as I said, while there may be some legislative components, a lot of it is just doing a better job and a more coordinated job with the dollars we have.
The Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University estimates that state governments spend about 15% of their budgets on drug-related issues. That was a statistic in your press release that surprised myself, including several others. How can this plan reduce that amount? Well,
a number of ways. I talked some about doing more early interventions, screening. So when people come into an emergency room, that we're asking the questions. We're training physicians and others to ask the questions to see if that's someone we need to refer for treatment or for more evaluation. We need to integrate chemical dependency and addiction recovery efforts into our health reform discussion. So often, substance abuse is put in its own little corner, treated in its own way with its own special dollars. We need to bring it into our healthcare system. Where I see a lot of the dollar impacts of addiction, it's not just in our substance abuse program, it's much more in our Medicaid program. Think about the healthcare dollars that we spend because of addiction. Think about, we have the child welfare responsibilities in the Department of Human Services. If you go into those court hearings to see when the courts are having to deal with taking kids out of their homes, putting them in foster care, so much of that is driven by parents' substance abuse problems. So if we can get our arms around those problems, we not only help those kids, we save our state dollars for having to take them out of the home in the first place.
And Commissioner, this is a multi-agency plan, and it involves so many different areas, from schools to you and your department. So do you think it can be effective, given that there are just so many players and so many cooks in the kitchen?
I think that's the only way we're going to have a big impact in Minnesota, but we have to be coordinated. So we need, for example, working with the Department of Corrections on their treatment in their facilities. Most of the people who end up in our correctional system, they have substance abuse problems. We need to make sure they get treatment early, so that because most of those people are going to be released, and we want them to come out with a better chance of being in sustained recovery, not just cycling back to addiction and usually cycling back to our prisons. So that's why I was just so felt so good about the fact that there were so many state agencies that came together and said, yes, this is the right direction. Now we're going to be going out in other parts of the state and reaching out to local law enforcement, local public health officials, and local physicians and other healthcare providers, because this isn't just about state government, it's about our state as a whole. We need to have that commitment to make it work.
Okay, with those words, Commissioner Lucinda Jesson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Traditionally, every 2 years, the legislature sifts through hundreds of project proposals hoping to be included in the final capital investment bill. Recently, that process took a unique twist, and before we detail what the changes were, John Brune explains what the traditional process is.
Borrowing money to pay for capital improvement projects is often referred to as bonding. A capital improvement is considered the construction or repair of new or existing publicly owned buildings, public property, or land. In addition to being publicly owned, a capital improvement must have a useful life of more than 10 years. Bonding is paying for capital improvements through the sale of general obligation bonds.
The process starts when the legislature enacts and the governor signs a bonding bill. That bonding bill authorizes the state to sell bonds. In other words, to take on debt to pay for specified projects. Bonding is exactly like a mortgage. Instead of having one lender, like a bank in a mortgage, you have a lot of lenders who are the investors in your bonds. And they're getting an interest rate in exchange for having fronted you the money.
Determining which projects will be recommended as part of a bonding bill is the responsibility of legislative committees, where members may spend many hours reviewing numerous project requests.
The capital investment committees for both the House and the Senate get educated about all of the projects that have requested bonding money. And they do that in several ways. One is that they travel the state in the fall and maybe early winter, and they get a chance to see the projects firsthand. And also they may have hearings at locations outside of the Capitol to hear from local officials who are asking for the projects, or from agency officials who are asking for the projects. And then also, the capital investment committees may have hearings here at the Capitol during session where they hear about more projects. And that's their way of getting educated about the projects to make choices about which ones they want to fund.
Bonding requests pour in from all over the state. Lawmakers do their best to whittle them down into a manageable and acceptable bonding bill, as was the case in 2012.
There were over 300 project requests for over $3 billion. And less than $500 million was approved in the bonding bill. So half to 2/3 of the projects are not funded each year.
Once the projects have been determined and the bonding bill becomes law, a bidding process begins to determine who will sell the state's bonds.
The Minnesota Management and Budget Office organizes an auction where underwriters bid to be the one to sell our bonds. And then the one that bids the lowest interest rate is the one who gets the contract to issue the bonds, and then they sell them to investors. So investors don't buy the bonds directly from the state, they buy them from underwriters.
Typically, the legislature debates a bonding bill during the second year of each two-year legislative biennium. However, legislators are not limited to the every other year tradition. Bonding bills were passed and signed by the governor in both 2011 and 2012.
The 2012 legislature moved away from that traditional bonding process to allocate $47.5 million to the Department of Employment and Economic Development. That money is for projects not included in the final bonding bill, with Deed scoring each proposal and ultimately deciding on 9 projects, including a new home for the St. Paul Saints.
We took the objective measurements of the number of construction jobs, permanent jobs, again, leverage of private investment. You know, I believe the owners are putting in $10 million of a $54 million project, so bringing private, you know, that we were all about private leverage, private jobs, and things like that. So you just do the math, it was a highly scoring project. And in addition, the site that they're leaving will be redeveloped for job purposes with the Port Authority, have a strong track record of bringing more jobs in on that end of the project as well. So, you know, everybody wants to focus on baseball, but it was a great community project, and it scored very highly.
The fund itself, which was really an idea of the legislature, can't remember exactly who, and I went along with it, I agreed to it. It was to create a fund, and it was understood that this would be one of the projects considered, but it was never a designated project. The legislature didn't designate any projects.
The chair of the Senate Capital Investment Committee and Majority Leader David Senjem joins me to talk a little bit about this deed grant process. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Good to be here, Julie.
Senator, arguably the biggest story to come from this would be the new stadium for the St. Paul Saints, which you know they're saying is going to spark a revitalization effort in Lower Town for St. Paul. Now, you questioned this selection in your press release. Why, in your opinion, does this project miss the mark? And let's talk a little bit about all of the projects.
Well, I'm not going to suggest it was a bad project. It does mean a lot to downtown St. Paul. I just don't think that it has, if you will, the economic vitality that other projects may have. In my case, and not to sound too parochial, a 3 or 4 month baseball stadium versus a more active facility that does conventions in a high-powered way all year long. I think, you know, you can just think about that a little bit. I think, you know, the whole emphasis of the program was economic development, and I just don't think that those two compare very well.
And we'll go a little bit more into those projects in just a moment. But as chair of the Senate Capital Investment Committee, kind of discuss for the sake of our viewers how this deed process, this grant process, even came into reality.
Well, we were working, of course, on our bill. The House was working on their bill. We entertained a bill which had a number of local projects in it. They had a bill also which had some local project in it, much smaller bill. At that point, but their bill did not contain any civic centers at all. So at that point, we were sort of in an impasse in this thing, and we really got to start to question ourselves about how we deal with local projects, and how do we make this thing fair? How do we kind of avoid earmarks? And what we decided to do is try to take the politics out of this thing, and frankly put together a set of criteria based on economic development principles, and allocate some money. And not unlike what we do for sewer and water projects or even road and bridge projects and area transportation, could we possibly come up with a program that would allow for then local projects to be bonded for based on merit and based on economic development virtues. And that was the essence of the program, and we put in the end $47.5 million to try to do that. So then it's a matter of whether or not it was successful.
You know, the governor stated in the news conference when he announced these projects, his quote, "When given lemons, you make lemonade." So first, do you think the concept of allowing these grant dollars to be distributed is a lemon, and do you think the projects reflect lemonade?
No, I don't think so. I think, let's just think about this a little bit. We live in a very political world. If any given senator, or for that matter House member, has a project, it's obviously the best project in the world. And so you get all these projects, and obviously you've got limited resources. How does the Senate or the House, in a way that's balanced and as devoid as politics as can be, how do we make those decisions? And it's very difficult, I will tell you that. And by and large, it falls down to who's the majority party and all the earmarking and all of that thing. We tried to take that out of the process and base it on merit. So I think that the process is worthy, and we shouldn't give up on it right away. I think we ought to just stay the course and think about this a little bit more. Maybe we have to tweak the criteria, but I think that it is something that if in fact adopted, would be healthy. We don't argue about where sewer and water projects go. DEED does them. And we don't argue about where road and bridge projects go. Department of Transportation does them. We allocate the money and give the agency then the wherewithal to make those decisions.
And you talked a little bit about the scoring process and projects in general. Now, the governor did include light rail in the final list. Do you think it's appropriate, in your opinion, for the state's chief executive to step in and include a project that he deems appropriate, that maybe didn't score quite as high with the DEED scoring system?
And that's the kind of the funny part about how this worked out. There were a couple of projects there. I think the Luth parking lot and the light rail, which did, in his own scoring, come in quite low, and yet nonetheless he included it. So it was obvious to me that maybe the criteria didn't mean much to the process, and maybe even his own scoring in the end didn't mean much to the process, and for whatever reason he selected what he did, and I guess we live with that at this point. So that simply says to me, if this is a good process, maybe it needs to be tweaked a little bit. Maybe we just need to put a little bit more restrictions in terms of the latitude of DEED or the governor, whoever that might be, into this process and try to make it work better.
Civic centers, as you mentioned, did not get included in the final bill. So are you going to try again in the next bonding session?
Well, there's no question. I don't think, in my mind at least, we'll have the Mankato Civic Center, the St. Cloud one will come back, the Rochester one will come back, possibly even another one, I don't know. But they'll be there. I don't think there's any question about it, and we'll just have to see if we can make it work.
Senator, I want to look ahead a little bit here. Traditionally, these bonding bills have been just a compilation of rural projects, urban projects, well represented throughout the state. As you mentioned, there was real discussion about what should be included in a bonding project and what shouldn't be. Do you think that tradition is going maybe to the wayside and that bonding bills will reflect a different philosophy moving forward?
Quite possibly. I drive down the road wondering about this, and we have a lot of state needs, for instance. I'm not suggesting at all right now that we move away from funding local projects, but when we do that, let's say we take $100 million out of a bill and put it towards local projects, knowing full well ourselves that we have roofs that need repairing, we have all kinds of state facilities that are standing by then or standing aside as we do local projects. So it's not necessarily easy to put this in statute in terms of how you do it, but I think more and more we'll be looking at state assets because we just have to. We have crumbling infrastructure all over.
Okay, Senator Dave Senjem, thanks so much for joining us today. As always, we appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you, Julie.
When Governor Mark Dayton announced the 9 projects that were getting the $47.5 million from DEED, one of those was light rail. And Representative Ryan Winkler applauded that decision. He's here now to explain why you think that light rail should have been included. So thanks for joining us on Capitol Report. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with that question. Southwest Corridor Light Rail Transit was awarded $2 million despite not being scored high by DEED in this process. So you applauded the decision. Why do you think it's important to include this project?
Well, one of the most important things government can do to spur economic growth is to make sure people can connect to jobs and to make sure that a growing metropolitan region like the Twin Cities has a good mass transit system to move people around, move goods, move people. And that's one of the core roles of government in making sure our economy works well.
So Representative Winkler, I want to ask you, is it appropriate, in your opinion, for the state's chief executive, the governor, to step in and include a project that wasn't included by DEED?
Well, I think the governor came in and used some common sense to include the Southwest Corridor Light Rail project. Frankly, I think the rankings that came from the Department of Employment and Economic Development were a bit odd. It's, I think, strange to claim that there's a bigger regional impact for a athletic field in the Minneapolis Public Schools, or a bigger regional impact for a stadium in St. Paul than there is for a light rail transit system that connects the entire metropolitan area together. So I think there were some flaws in the DEED rankings, and the governor was right to use some common sense.
Senator Senjem agrees with you. There could be some flaws in this process. He'd like to see the grant process continue and yet maybe look at tweaking that criteria a bit to make it a bit less political, using his words. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think if you're going to create a grant program, you should set out some criteria that need to be met, but you also have to have confidence that the people doing the evaluating are doing it fairly. The idea of taking politics out of government spending decisions is like taking medicine out of the doctor's office. There's no way you can do it, and you're not supposed to. Politics is how you sort out different competing interests, and you try to make the best accommodation that works for everyone. And it might not always be pretty to look at, but the legislature is actually the best place to sort those differences out.
And so given that, do you think that future bonding bills should maybe continue to look at including projects that some do consider local, like civic centers, or do you think they should focus on statewide infrastructure?
Well, I think the primary goal for any bonding project has to be its long-term economic impact for the state. And we have an interest as a state to make sure that local communities are strong and vibrant, so I think civic centers can be part of the mix. But we have a more fundamental interest in infrastructure like transportation, in research and innovation and education, the kind of people-building activities of government, and that's the best thing we can fund, and I think our capital investment dollars should go to support those things as well.
And now I'd like to go back to the actual $47.5 million in the DEED grants. When the press conference took place, the governor essentially stated, when given lemons, you make lemonade. So in your opinion, do you think the concept of even allowing these grant dollars to be distributed by the Department of Employment and Economic Development, do you think that that constitutes a lemon? And then do you think the projects that they supported were lemonade?
I guess I'm not sure about my fruit analogies when it comes to this project.
Just
I think the legislature couldn't make a decision about what it wanted to do. A lot of Republicans didn't want to vote for some of these projects, so they kind of punted over to the governor, and we have to accept the results of that. I think by and large the governor made good decisions, and Republicans shouldn't be upset after they sent the football over to the governor if he ran up the field a different direction than he wanted. They're the ones who gave him the ball. And
you did say that you think that it's the legislature's responsibility to put this bonding bill together, but do you like the idea at all? Does it have any merit of allowing some grant dollars to go to DEED? to continue this?
Yeah, I do think it makes some sense. In transportation, we let the Department of Transportation make decisions about where to allocate resources. We don't get involved in earmarking transportation projects. So I do think there is some merit in having expert advice and opinion from neutral parties make some assessments and help guide those dollars. It does make some sense. But I think as a practical matter, the legislature will have to sort out those priorities, and there's just no way of making it a pure, clean, unpolitical process.
I want to ask you one last question, and it's just kind of speculation, but there was a lot of talk about accountability in how many jobs are created from a lot of these bonding projects. You are asserting that each project should have some long-term economic impact for the state. So do you think that it should be accountable as well? Should there be some teeth to these? Should people come forward with numbers and hard statistics and hard, dollars of money that they think they can bring in?
Everybody brings forward numbers and statistics. Very often they're flawed because they don't look at the economic reality, which is if you spent that same amount of money on one project, you're not spending it somewhere else. And so you're really not necessarily creating anything new, you're just kind of picking which one works best. So the analysis of whether or not a project is really a worthy one should be based on really rigorous analysis. We didn't see that from DEED this time. I think maybe in the future, if we look at this more carefully, we could bring some hard numbers and a nonpartisan analysis, but it's going to take a lot more work than what we saw this time.
And I want to go back to something you said a little bit earlier. We do want to touch real quickly upon the new ballpark for the St. Paul Saints, and you're questioning its merit. So do you think it does merit some state dollars, given the economic impact that it could have?
Well, the Saints Stadium will help create some construction jobs now. I think that's a good thing in a down economy. That's kind of state stimulus. But you're fundamentally not going to create a lot of new economic activity. You're just moving it from one part of St. Paul to another part of St. Paul. And if it's because people want to have a new stadium to go to, I think that's legitimate. It's fine to spend public money to create assets that people like. But it's not necessarily a good economic project. It doesn't mean that it's going to create more activity or more jobs down the road. It just is something that makes our communities nicer to live in. And I think if we evaluate it as it's a nice to have as opposed to a job creator, we're better off.
So do you not think, the argument is that it'll spur some economic development and growth in Lower Town St. Paul. Do you think that it could have that effect?
It could have some effect, but there's no reason to expect that it would have that effect there more than where the stadium already is. The best numbers show that it's less than $1 million a year in economic impact, and yet the state's spending $25 million a year to help build it, which as part of a much larger project. So the question is, are tax dollars really getting a great return when they're being used to move economic activity in a relatively small amount from one place to another?
Representative Winkler, we certainly appreciate your time on all of these issues, so thank you again.
Thanks.
It's now easier to stay in touch with activity at the state capitol. Senate Media Services is on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Find the links on our homepage. So follow us and follow the Senate. And that concludes this week's program. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartkey. Thank you for watching Capitol Report.